Hello and welcome to the last lesson that we are doing for Math 9 this year. Congratulations, you've made it. So we're going to be doing our final lesson 9.2. This is the second lesson of statistics. We're going to talk about sample versus census. In 9.1, we talked about data collection, and then we talked about problems with data collection. So we talked about all kinds of cool things like time constraints, cost constraints, use of language when collecting data with surveys, the bias that you hold when collecting information. So all kinds of cool things with problems when you try to collect data. Today's conversation is around sample versus census. Census means that you are collecting information from every single person in which you are trying to get information about. That group of people is called your population. So population is the people that you're trying to get information from. Census means that you're getting information from all people. Okay, census, all people. So for example, if we wanted to know something about grade 9 students, we're like, what's grade 9 students' favorite subject, favorite option? What we would do to get a census is we would have to ask every single grade 9 student what their favorite option was. Wonderful. The other option you have, instead of getting a census when you're doing your surveys, is to just take a sample of your population. A sample means that you're only taking some of the people's opinion and using that. So you're taking a portion of the population or just some of the population. Again, if we want to know every grade 9 student's favorite option, if we were like, well, we can't ask them all, we could take a sample of the grade 9s and maybe ask just 50 of the grade 9s what their favorite option is. That would be taking a sample. There's pros and cons to both, and both get used in real life context. So we'll start with talking about a sample. The pro of a sample, the biggest pro of a sample is it's easy to collect the info. It's accurate when done properly. I shouldn't say it's completely accurate, but accurate enough when collected properly. And another big pro with taking samples is, especially when we're doing very big surveys, we say it's cost efficient, meaning that it doesn't cost too much to be trying to run one of these surveys if you're just doing a sample. The con of doing a sample survey is that not every person, I'm going to say member, of the population gets a say. So that's the first big problem. Not everyone got to have their say. So if you're trying to understand what's going on with a group of people, not getting some people's information doesn't really seem fair. The second biggest con is there is potential for errors in predictions. So typically we use sample information to try to predict something. Like if we were trying to talk about the vote for the election, you might hear when it's election time that, oh, the conservatives are going to get elected. That's what polls say. That's based on sample information. And then sometimes there's errors in those polls, meaning that it's not actually predicting the right thing. And then it turns out what it predicted is wrong, and that sample was not accurate. So with a sample, there's potential for errors when you're making predictions. Census. The biggest pro of a census is that everybody gets a say. Every member gets a say. All right, that's easily the biggest pro. If I want to know what grade 9s think about an option and I can ask every single grade 9, that is going to give me confidence in what you guys think is the best option. This means that there's little room for error when making predictions on the info. All right. It's possible people could change their mind after they give you data, stuff like that. But if you ask every single person, it creates very little room for errors. This means it's very accurate. Cons. The biggest con of a census is very difficult to gather a census. I'm going to say information from each member. Hey, that is hard to do, right? It's hard to get a hold of every single person in a population. For instance, if we want the grade nines to tell us what their best option is, I have to then set up time to make sure every single grade 9 student answers me, and that's a lot of work and not easy to do. The second biggest con of a census is it's expensive usually. If you're doing one of, say, all the people in Sylvan Lake, that is a lot of people that you're trying to get information from, and that is going to be expensive. You're going to pay people to go get that information. You're going to have to create surveys or whatever you're doing. It's expensive. Okay, so that's why censuses don't get used very often. Down here, there's 2 questions. I want you to read them, pause this video, give it a try, and see if you can figure out if it's a census or a sample, and then tell me why. Wonderful. Hopefully you tried that. For A, it says 60 out of 600 people that attend a gym are surveyed to determine how many days of the week they attend the gym. This is a sample survey. The reason it's a sample is not every one of the 600 members at the gym got to answer the survey. So if not every single person got a say, then that is a sample. If you read B, it says all people that live in Red Deer County are surveyed to determine whether or not they're happy with the new movie theater. This is a consensus. Sorry, this is a census, not a consensus. Census. Every member of the population, in this case Red Deer County, was allowed to answer the survey. So that is a census because everybody got a say. Awesome. Types of samples. So when it comes to sampling the population, which we usually do samples more than censuses, just because a census is expensive and it takes a lot of effort. So typically what we see is we see samples, and we see different types of way of gathering samples. The first way we gather a sample is using something called convenience. This is probably one of the worst ways to do a sample. Basically, you just grab whoever is easily available. So, for instance, if the principal wanted to know what the word of the week was going to be, they would just choose the first 3 boys that she sees. Okay, that's extremely convenient. It was easy to go gather the information. They don't care about how many people they surveyed. They don't care about if they got different types of people in the survey. They just chose the first 3. Okay, that's called a convenience sample. A simple but random survey means that you made it pretty easy, right? You didn't make anything crazy, so no restrictions. You kept it simple, but you randomized who you chose. So anyone in your group of population could be chosen, and we just simply pick them. Okay, so you're easily taking random people. For instance, if we want to know 5 people in class and we want to know their opinion on their favorite cereal, I'd put all your names in a hat and I would just draw the names 5 out random. That is a random draw, and it's a simple draw, right? I didn't care if I got 3 boys and 2 girls. I didn't care if I got all girls. I just picked randomly, and I made it very simple. There was no restrictions on what I was doing. That's better than convenience typically because at least it's randomized, right? I didn't just pick the people who sit in the front row or the first 3 people off the bus, right? At least I randomized it so everybody got an equal shot. But being a simple survey means that you could have still made an accident. Sorry, we just had an interruption at the door and dogs went crazy. You probably heard that. Sorry. So what we were talking about was simple random and how it's not quite as good as a convenient, or it's a bit better than a convenient, but it's not quite perfect because there is still possibility that in my randomness, I have picked all girls or all boys. And if I did something like that, there would exist a bias, which we talked about 9.1, and that bias could change the way that my survey ends up going. So for instance, if I ask people what their favorite magazine is, and I did randomly chose people from our classroom, it's possible that I could choose 5 people who are all really into cars, and then their favorite magazines would all be car magazines. And that doesn't do a good job of representing the population. Even though it was random, I ended up getting students who all had shared the same bias. Okay, a stratified random. A stratified random is probably the best way that you could do a survey, in my opinion. Okay, so random means it's still anybody could get selected, right? It's still equal chances, but stratified means that I have gone out and strategically chosen from different groups of people. So, for instance, if I wanted to do a random survey on what movie to watch at Christmas time with our classroom, instead of just randomly picking 10 students from our class, I would make sure that I picked 5 boys and 5 girls. So I'm strategically trying to split up some of the biases so that I get someone from each group. Okay. For instance, if we tried to do the whole school population and we were like, what do you guys want to see more of at HJ Cody? Instead of just doing a random draw, which then I might end up picking all the grade 12s, I could do a stratified random draw, which means I go and pick some grade 9s, some grade 10s, some grade 11s, and some grade 12s. There's a little bit more strategy to my random selection. That's my favorite kind, and I think that kind is usually the best because you're putting into consideration of who you're picking, and you're making it random. The next kind that we have is systematic. We see systematic a lot. So this is where you just create a system and then you do that system. So for instance, you could say, I'm going to pick every 5th person who walks into the class and I'm going to survey them. Now that is good. It is just kind of it's a way of creating randomness. But sometimes in a systematic situation, you don't always end up picking randomly. So even in a system where it might seem random, it's possible that every 5th person ended up being a girl or something like that, for whatever weird reason. And now you have some sort of bias within your systematic strategy. So it's still good, and it's a way of creating randomness, but it's not perfect. Self-selected. That's probably the type that we see the most of, that people take too much credit for. So, for instance, self-selected means anyone is allowed to say what they want, but they don't have to. So if I, for instance, was asking people what's their favorite music, and they could either answer the survey or not answer the survey, there's a good chance that only the people who really care about music will answer the question, in which case I might be creating a biased situation where I'm not counting the people who truly are passionate about music and their vote is not getting counted. We see a lot of self-selected when it comes to surveys about politics, because typically people who self-select to call in and tell you what they're going to vote openly, typically those people fall into different categories, and those categories have their own set of biases. Usually you're picking only people who have the time on their hand to constantly be answering surveys, stuff like that, are the ones who are going to answer it. Weirdly enough, it ends up being like senior people or something like that, right? Seniors usually have a little bit more time on their hand. They can answer surveys, stuff like that. So self-selected is good in the fact that it's kind of easy. You just send it out there and people answer. They don't answer, it's their choice. But it's not good in the sense that you're definitely going to create some sort of bias or opportunity for mistakes in your data collection. Okay, there's 5 different definitions here on the left, all bolded, and then 5 situations on the right. I want you to make an attempt right now, so pause this video and see if you can match up each definition to each situation. Okay, so if you did this, you should have gotten the following arrows, hopefully. So we'll start with random sample. A random sample means you've created some sort of random system to draw people. So 50 employees' names drawn from a hat, that is just random. Okay, it's drawing from a hat, nice and easy. Stratified random sample. So stratified means strategic. There's a strategy to your randomness. So if we were reading this, we have 5 people from each grade. That would be a strategy. I've broken it up into grade. That's my strategy. And then 5 people is my randomness. Awesome. convenient sample. So convenient sample means it was just done easily. There's no randomness to it. It's just done easy. So we have every third house after a random starting point, everyone who calls into a radio show, or everyone who orders a sandwich after 7. Everyone who orders a sandwich after 7 would be the easiest way to do something. I just decided, okay, after 7 o'clock, I'm going to start doing a survey. Self-selected means people had to choose to vote in your survey. Our two options are every third house or everyone who calls into a radio show. That would be my self-selected. You had to choose to call into the radio show. The last one is a systematic sample. That means you created some sort of system to try to create randomness. So by saying every third house, I've created a system, and that means it's systematic. Awesome. We've got some situations here. We are going to describe how the sample could be selected, or we're going to just discuss how it was selected. A, it says, a teacher wishes to get feedback from her class about the school dance. She plans to survey 5 students out of a class of 30. How could she create this sample? I think the best way to do this was if she's doing it from just her class, she could put all 30 names into a hat and draw 5 names. This would be a simple random sample. It's a simple system. We just threw the names in the hat, and then we randomly chose them. B, a telephone company wants to determine whether a fitness center would be well used by its 3,000 employees. The company plans to survey 300 employees. How could they possibly do that? One way they could do that is they could sort the employees into different categories, i.e. job titles or age or where they live, and then randomly select people from each group. This would be a random sample, but it's not a simple random sample. It's a stratified random sample. I'm gonna look up how to spell stratified. The reason it's stratified is because I've created a system, right? I created categories. I said, okay, here's all the people by age, and then I want to make sure I survey people from each age group. Okay, that would allow me to make sure I've done a good job and I didn't accidentally pick all the seniors that work there or all the very young people who work there. And I want to break it up somehow. C, a chain store is trying to decide whether to open a store in Camrose. The company decides to survey people in Camrose and 3 nearby towns. The population of each location is shown. What they could do for this one is they could survey a select number of people from each community. So from Camrose, for instance, they might do 5,000 people. For Bashaw, they might do 100. From Tofield, a couple hundred. Daysland, maybe 20 people. Right? But they're breaking it up by community. Instead of just randomly letting people answer, they are surveying a select number of people from each part of the community. So some from Camrose, some from Bashaw, some from Tofield, some from Daysland. When doing this, I would survey the most people in Camrose, second most Tofield, third most Bashaw, and least from Daysland. The reason why is I want it to be proportionate, right? I don't want to have 200 people from Daysland and 200 people from Camrose. Camrose has 16,000 people, so they should get the most votes, in my opinion. That would allow me to get a good sample from my population. This would count as, this would be a stratified random sample, right? I've created a strategy to randomly sample people. D, a marketing research company mails surveys to all the adult residents in town. The survey asks about the brands of consumer products. The residents are asked to mail the respondents in a prepaid envelope. Okay, they already told us kind of what they did. This would be a self-selected. because people had the choice of responding or not. And it's all the people had a choice of responding or not. So they're choosing, they're self-selecting whether or not they want to participate. Awesome. E, a restaurant owner wants to know the favorite pizza topping of his customers. He plans to survey every customer who orders a pizza in his restaurant between 5 p.m. and 10 p.m. one evening. That's tricky. You could almost say it's systematic. I would say this is just convenience, though. Right? He just selected a random way to do it. He's like, I'm just going to go from 5 to 10, and whoever answers. Is it he? He picked, yeah, it is he. An easy way to survey people without any real randomness. I should say true randomness. Awesome. Example 4. In each case, explain why a population is surveyed instead of a sample. So A, it says to determine the average number of siblings in his classmates, Carlos surveyed each person in his class. The reason why census would be better for this, remember census means you're surveying everybody, is better for this because it is easy and affordable to survey all people in the class. So the benefits of a sample don't really apply, right? The biggest benefit of a sample is that you could be fast and cheap. If I'm just looking to survey everyone in my class, I can already do that really easily and cheap and get a census. It also gives me 100% accuracy in my survey. Part B. Every 5 years, Statistics Canada conducts a census. One question in the survey is used to determine the ages of the people in each household. This is actually quite expensive, but this is a census because we do not want to be guessing on populations or ages. We want to know with 100% certainty how many people live in each home and how old they are. So you can make predictions on all kinds of things. How many schools you need, right? You need to have a census on things like that. You don't want to just be taking a random sample and then accidentally thinking, oh my goodness, we don't need many schools because there's not a lot of kids in this community, when reality is your sample just had an error in it. We don't want room for error. So this would be a census situation. You want 100% accuracy. Wonderful. Determining if a survey is valid. So if a survey is a census, it's almost always valid. When you're doing just a sample, we typically try to go for 10 to 20% of the population. And you definitely want to do some sort of randomness. If you have not enough people vote in a survey, then it kind of ruins the validity of that survey. So for instance, if I say, what's everybody's favorite subject in the class? And instead of giving everyone a vote, I only ask one student, does that one student accurately portray the entire class? Probably not. If I took 3 students' votes, do 3 students accurately portray the entire class? Probably not, right? I mean, they might, but they probably don't because that population group is too small. So you're usually aiming for about 20% of the population as an acceptable range. Awesome. Example 5. For the following questions, determine whether a sample or census was used and if the conclusions are valid. Okay, so this is going to be some good discussion points. Question A says, the school council at a large high school wants to know if students would like to have a dance to celebrate the end of the year. This council surveys 2 girls from each grade to find out. Okay. First off, is this a sample or a census? This is a sample because not every student got a vote. Now let's talk about the validity of this. I would say this is not a valid survey because 2 girls from each grade is it not enough people for a large high school. There's not enough people surveyed to represent a large high school. Right? Imagine if we did that for our school and we said, okay, let's see if we have a dance at the end of the year or not. And I only asked 2 grade 9s, 2 grade 10s, 2 grade 11s, and 2 grade 12s. That's 8 people giving a whole say for HJ Codia, which is hundreds of people. That's not enough people. There is a second issue with the validity of this. The second issue is only girls were asked, which creates what we call a gender bias. Okay, so if you're only asking one gender or majoritarily asking one gender, we call that a gender bias because females tend to vote in a certain way and males tend to vote more in a single way. If we think about dances, the girls might really love dances, so they might vote in favor of it, or girls might really hate dances at that school. And so they would all vote against it. And that's not fair to the other group of the population, the other genders, on whether or not you have a dance. So whenever you're just choosing one group of people like that to vote from, that creates a problem in the validity of that survey. B, to find out what percentage of population of Alberta has access to the internet, all residents of Calgary were surveyed. Okay, first let's talk about if it's a sample or not. This is a sample because Calgary is only a part of Alberta. Not all Albertans were asked. Okay, so that's a big problem here, is that you've only asked people in Calgary. In this case, all people in Calgary, which is nice, but you're missing a lot of Albertans. I would say enough people were sampled to make this somewhat valid. However, there is a bias that needs to be considered. When doing a survey, if we're trying to survey all Albertans, Calgarians don't represent every Albertan. The biggest thing is if you're from Calgary, you're from the city where getting internet is quite easy. People who weren't surveyed were people who were living in rural areas and on farms, out in the country, on acreages. Those people have a much harder time accessing the internet. So I would say this is not a valid survey because Calgarians would have a biased response that might not represent all Albertans. If I were to guess, I would say that if you did this survey and you said, do you have access to internet? 99% of Calgarians would say yes. If you were to go ask people who didn't live in cities and we said only people in the country, do you have access to internet? I would think it's still pretty high, just because nowadays we do a really good job of getting internet out to people. But if we did do that survey, I bet you it would still be a lot lower than in the city, and it might be more like 95% or something like that. So by choosing only people from Calgary, you're creating a bias in your response, which means that the survey is no longer valid enough. Wonderful. This unit is kind of always up for debate, right? It's a great unit for talking and discussing things and doing surveys in class, which unfortunately we just can't do, and we can't have those great debates. So it would be a really good topic to just bring up and talk with your family or your friends and be like, what do you think about bias? What do you think about this? Is this a good way of asking things? And start thinking critically about things you hear in the world, right? So when you read the news or you see something on the news and they say 75% of people hate Trudeau, you need to really take into consideration who's being surveyed, right? Maybe they're only surveying people who are really in support of something that Trudeau is not in support of. You could do the same thing the opposite way. You could say 75% of people love Trudeau. Well, maybe they only surveyed people who are on the same side of the arguments as Trudeau, and they didn't do a good job sampling the population of Canada. Really be critical when you hear numbers. One of the best things I think I ever learned in university math was that if you're good with numbers, you can pretty much make numbers say anything you want when it comes to statistics. So be very critical of what people are telling you, especially when they say this percent of people. Because there's a very good chance that they have skewed things or asked things in certain ways or asked certain people or asked at the right time of day or time of year to get the response they want. It was fun doing Math 9. I miss you all. I hope to see you all soon. Take care.